We want to hear the stories from the courses that you've taught. Whether in a lab, a classroom, kitchen, on Zoom, or in a shop. Drawing on your expertise, we'll ask the probing questions. What goes right and what goes wrong when teaching your favorite lesson? Hello, everyone. Welcome back to My Favorite Lesson, a podcast hosted by Teaching and Learning with Conestoga College. My name is Dr. Lauren Spring, and I am here today with Anthony Piscitelli, and he is a professor with the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and the program coordinator for public service and applied research programs. Hi, Anthony.
Hello, Lauren.
Thank you for being here with us.
Well, thanks for having me today. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I really am too. So let's get right into it. So why don't you start by telling us maybe how long you've been with the college and sort of the path that you journeyed along to get here?
So I've been full-time with the college since 2017, but my first experience teaching at the college came in 2014. I taught one class. It was an evening class. It was actually a Friday evening class, and I did that because I was working full-time at the region of Waterloo at the time, and that was easiest for me. Obviously not the favorite time slot for the students. Despite all that, absolutely loved it. I just had a blast. It was a lot of fun being in the classroom. It was a big class, got to know a few of the students. And in that experience, I went and I approached the chair of the program and said, this was a lot of fun. I think I would like to maybe do this someday full time. He said, well, Anthony, you've only got a master's degree and we're really leaning towards PhDs at this point. So that was sort of the nudge that I needed to go back to school. And I started a PhD program a couple of years later. And about halfway through that program, the job opening in public service opened up, which I'd spent a decade in government and a few more years, 5 more years in the nonprofit sector. So it was sort of the perfect fit that came open at the right time. And I was fortunate to get hired before I finished the PhD. I did that once I was here, but it's something that I'd wanted to do for a long time. And I'm very fortunate that the right opportunity opened at the right time in my career.
That's wonderful. I have so many questions already. So I'm curious, that course that you were teaching part-time on Friday night while working with the region of Waterloo, what was that course?
So it was criminology theory.
Ooh.
And so I'm somebody who's had sort of a weird path to academia. Most people go, do your undergraduate degree, you find out what you like, you do a master's in that, and then you do your PhD in the same area. For me, I went and did my undergrad in political science and global studies, liked that, but then I got jobs in the nonprofit sector, and eventually I got a job at the region of Waterloo. And even doing my master's was a bit of a fluke. I was in a research-based role, and I started to do some analysis that required some more advanced statistical techniques than I'd done. So I went back and I took one class at Laurier in advanced statistics, enjoyed that class, and at the end of it, I was looking at some promotions at the region, and it became apparent to me that a master's degree was really needed to move my career in the next direction. And I had a conversation with the professor that taught that class, and I said, my marks as an undergrad weren't really the best. And he said, well, you did really well in my class, and clearly this is something you could succeed in. So he helped me get into the program, even though my marks were not good enough on their own to get in. So I got into a master's degree, and I did that part-time while working at the region. That was a little bit challenging. So it was a lot of late nights making up for missed work and doing the classwork. And then the PhD I started in I guess it would have been 2015. So I finished my master's in 2011. So I had a little bit of a gap between the two. And the master's was what made me qualified even to teach the criminology course. So I'd always thought I'd be done after my undergrad. And even when I did the master's, I did the thesis option, which nobody does. And I explained, well, I did the thesis option because I'm not doing any more schooling. I'm absolutely done. But I would love to have one big research project that's my own instead of decided by work. And then my PhD's in geography. And I focused on the geography of crime. And this is because I've been working at the region of Waterloo in crime prevention. Oh, okay. So I'm interested in it. It's not a passion of mine. So this is, most people, you do a PhD because you're passionate about the subject.
Yeah.
I did my PhD because I wanted to work at the college. So I picked a topic area that I'd done a great deal of work in, and I was able to sort of package, and it was more work too, but I was able to package a lot of the learning that I'd done before that. Now my research as a professor has really shifted. So I'm now at the point in my career where I am doing what I'm passionate about, which is the total opposite of most people, right? You start your careers in school and you do research that you're passionate about.
All self-selected,
Yeah, for me now I'm actually at a point in my career where I can do self-selected. So my research now is really focused on governance of nonprofit and cooperative enterprises, and a little bit into social finance and how we can be effective as a society and launching co-ops and nonprofits and other social enterprises.
Really? And what about that kind of has your heart?
So alongside all of this, I've spent over a decade on the board of Your Neighborhood Credit Union and its predecessor credit unions. And that is something that my mom actually was on credit unions before she passed away. She was on their boards. And so sort of my whole life has been involved in the cooperative movement through the credit unions. And once I got involved in credit unions on the board myself, I became more interested in the idea of cooperative organizations. And really the idea that purpose can drive an organization much more so than in a traditional shareholder-led corporation. When you think of traditional shareholder corporations, really you're seeing that the profit motive is driving things. And even when an organization tries to put purpose out in front, you'll see them still justifying decisions on, at the end of the day, this will be profitable for us. We can be good to our employees because that means the employees will work hard and will be more profitable. Whereas a co-op and credit unions and mutuals can really focus just like a nonprofit and say, what can we do to really benefit our membership? And we need to be profitable, but we need to be profitable because that profit is needed to make sure that we survive in perpetuity as an organization. So it allows the purpose really to drive the organization. It's something that my research has started to look at, and it's something that I already knew intrinsically from being involved in credit unions that's the way that co-ops can operate.
That's so fascinating. And I mean, I wonder, because we do have this profit motive paradigm sort of, right? Is it in your work, do you find that even these co-ops or credit unions, et cetera, is there some like slippage? Do they kind of, is it, so I guess it's, what I'm asking is, it seems hard to forge a different path when that's kind of the common way of doing things. And do you find sometimes, there's a consistent need to remind people, no, we're trying to find something else, or it can be harder to define because it's not as widespread as the profit motive?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll start with the nonprofit sector, because there it's a little cleaner, right? You don't have a profit motive at all.
Right.
You're 100%
your name,
focused on serving your members. But even there, you'll see things like mission creep. So the idea that organizations will go where the donations are, will go where the grants exist. So it can be a challenge in the nonprofit sector. In the credit union movement, in the cooperative sector, it obviously also is a challenge. And some of that comes from I think the broader societal pressure, where we've really have this idea that the social purpose of a business is to make money, right? Going back to Milton Friedman. So this idea really permeates society. And obviously, in credit unions, you're going to get people going from the banking system into the credit union system. So there is a cultural difference there. And the reality is, in co-ops, profit is important because you need that profit in order to be able to reinvest back in your members. And there's some realities that you have to have reserve funds too in banking, right? Because some years are great, probably going into a recession, so we're going to have some bad years. So it's really an act of balancing that. So the profit is kind of the easy thing to measure, and you do need that. But there needs to be people on the team who are thinking, and everyone really. But there's usually a few people on the team who are really galvanized by that mission and the purpose, and that can really drive the organization to ensure that they're really focused on meeting the needs of, in credit unions, the needs of the members, and in co-ops, really the purpose of the organization. And what that often leads to is that over time you realize that if you're focused on that mission and you do keep profit in mind, but just meeting that mission is often enough to ensure that the organization can survive in perpetuity. And we see this in the research. Co-ops are much more likely to survive as organizations than a new startup for-profit business.
Wow. And is this sort of, I mean, I suppose it's specific depending on the organization, the co-op, whatever they may be. It's not like, okay, we're not, solely motivated or primarily motivated by the profit that we can bring in, but then the alternative differs from organization to organization. Would that be fair to say?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess defining sort of, what that mission is and what benefits really they want to come of it. Or maybe, less widespread or at least folks, would it be fair to say that folks who come on and want to work for these places, the mission matters a lot to them and they kind of want to help perpetuate it?
I'd say there's two groups that come into co-ops and credit unions. So there's a group that certainly is driven by the mission. They're find that they're looking to be involved in a co-op or a credit union, and they're really attracted to that. And then the other group is somebody who comes who doesn't really have that background, doesn't really understand it. And that's the group that can be really exciting, because usually what happens with these individuals is they come into the organization, they realize the subtle differences, but how profound the impact can be just by this subtle difference of priorities. And oftentimes individuals in that latter group, you meet them 5-10 years into their career, and they're the biggest advocates for the system, and talking about how great it is, because they've got that comparison, right? They'll say, I used to work at this traditional, Fortune 500 company, and this was kind of what it was like. And now I go into a co-op or a credit union or a mutual, and all of a sudden it's this really different way of doing business, and it really excites them.
And that's neat. So I kind of didn't really know what they were signing up for, but then a few months in, like, I'm feeling pretty good. Why is that? And so your research in this domain, what are some of the guiding questions that you're looking at? Sounds like, comparatively their success versus other companies. What are some of the other things you're exploring with your research?
So I've got 3 studies that I'm mainly involved in right now. So the first is one that's basically wrapped up, and that was looking at how do board members in cooperatives and nonprofits try to represent the membership. So the idea is that these are membership-based organization, and that there is this connection to the membership. But the challenge as a board member, one of the overarching principles of governance and good governance is that you stay out of operations. I was a school board trustee for a little while.
Oh, really?
And one of the things that I can tell you as a trustee is I never once had a parent approach me talking about a strategic issue. They were talking to me about an operational issue. They were concerned about their bus routes. They were concerned about their kids and their classrooms. So those are the issues that we get. So my research actually came out of my trustee experience, where working with some colleagues, we started to ask, how does a board of directors and how do individual directors reconcile this difference from getting feedback in an operational sense, but having to try and help govern the organization in a strategy sense. And the research came up with some ideas about basically aggregating that information, bringing it up, but also allowing for some opportunities that even though your role is primarily governance, there's nothing to stop you from helping a parent talk to the right person and solve their problem. The second area that I'm looking at is in partnership with an organization called Union Sustainable Development Cooperative. So we've secured at Conestoga College a fairly large college community social innovation fund grant to help support the launch of this organization. So they're a for-profit cooperative that is providing affordable housing. And the basic idea is that retail investors, so average people like you and me, can invest in the cooperative, and in return for taking a little bit lower return on our investment, we know that we're helping to provide affordable housing. So when I got involved in that project, it was basically just an idea from a young entrepreneur, Sean Campbell, and now I've through this research grant, we've helped support them to the point where they've purchased their first building. Oh, wow. They've got over 100 tenants that are now under their domain.
Very neat.
And then the third project that I'm just kicking off and in the process of seeking some grant funding, as what we were talking about a little bit, is around board governance, board members have to act in the best interests of the corporation. And this is actually true in Canada for both for-profit, nonprofit, and cooperative directors. So even though we often think that the board members of for-profits have to act as the best interests of shareholders, the actual law says that they have to act in the best interest of the corporation as a whole. And there's been actually a fair bit of research around what this means for for-profit, publicly traded companies. But there's not been a lot of research about what does this mean for cooperatives and nonprofits. So the research study that in the early phases, we've basically written a theoretical paper with some colleagues, is looking at how should board members of co-ops act in the best interests of the corporations. And we're basically hoping to go and talk to some directors about this, but our theoretical framework is basically trying to balance the idea of purpose. Cooperatives tend to adhere to something called the 7 cooperative principles that are designed to guide their work. And those are things like member-led organizations, concern for community, cooperation amongst cooperatives. So how do you balance these? So we think you balance these principles with purpose and the idea of serving the members as a mechanism for determining what the best interests of a cooperative corporation is. So we want to talk to some directors and some members of organizations and see if that sort of framework makes sense.
That's so interesting. And I have to say, one thing that I have admired about you since coming to Conestoga, and that I know a lot of your colleagues do too, is not only your engagement in the classroom, but that you are engaged in these community-based research projects too, that are so important, because I think there's often a lot of really neat work going on in this community involving college faculty, and yet it's not always written about. Yeah.
So that was one of the things that really attracted me to Conestoga College, and I think I'm here at really the right time in the evolution of the college from an interdisciplinary studies perspective. When I think about my research and some of the work that I've done when I was a PhD candidate, a lot of it was very theoretical. And there's a theoretical sort of framework to it, and there's a focus. But the research that I'm really interested in doing here is very applied. And what excites me is the sort of application. So even this sort of theoretical pieces that I'm talking about here, I'm interested in them because I see really some practical applications that can help guide decision making. So the union co-op one is we're very involved in the project, giving advice and helping them figure out how to buy this first building. Yeah. With how do you represent the membership? There was some presentations that I've given to many directors now, talking about the practical recommendations we can make on how to do better at this. And this best interest piece, I think we could actually help build a framework that will help board members to make decisions in the best interest of the corporation and give them sort of a lens. So it's this applied piece that colleges have a lot more ability to do. And it's something that Conestoga College, I think, is at a kind of an exciting place where we've got more faculty in the interdisciplinary studies department that are really getting interested in doing applied research. And I think it bodes well for the contribution that we can make to our communities.
I love that. I mean, it's one of the things that attracted me to the college to even, doing my doctorate, other graduate degrees. My research has always been very community focused, and I've long been uncomfortable with that sort of ivory tower. Here's the research, and yet, the community members you're writing about aren't going to be able to access this journal or whatever it may be. So I'm curious from you, I mean, that seems to tie together nicely. And then all of these areas that you're currently researching, are you teaching courses on similar themes at the same time?
To a degree. So my program, I teach in 2 programs. So the one program is public service. So that's a program for people that want to work in government and the nonprofit sector. So a little bit of my research creeps into that. The other program is a new one that we just launched. It's the applied research program, and that's it's a postgrad program, and it's for people who really want to increase their research skills. So one of the really fun things that I get to do in that course is I teach the capstone course. And that's designed where all of the students in the class are doing their own research studies. And it's basically a seminar. So we're coming together once a week and we're talking about our research studies. And then we're also planning a future research study that we would do. And the fun thing for me in that class is I will come in and I will talk about a research study just like the students that I have going on, and
Oh,
we
cool.
rotate around who's chairing. And then I've used it as an opportunity to start planning my next research study. So it's really a fun class for me. So that's where I try to bring the emergent research and the research that's really current into the classroom. A little bit in the public service program, so some of the union co-op stuff, and when I talk about nonprofits, but the applied research has really allowed me to really thoroughly integrate my research right into my teaching.
Very neat. And so the lesson that you've brought to share with us today, which course is this one related to?
So it's from, I teach public policy in the public service program. Mm-hmm. And the lesson that I'd like to talk about is it's week 7 that I teach it, so right before reading week. So it's sort of a fun one that we do before the students get a week off.
Kickoff, yeah.
And it's focused in on climate change policy.
Oh, cool. Okay. Climate change policy within the public policy course. Great. So let us know a little bit maybe about what students kind of know about the theme up to this point, and then what you do on this particular day.
So the students are working through the policy cycle. So they're learning how essentially policy gets developed in government, how it gets on the government's agenda, and then we're just sort of now have turned our attention to policy decision making, and then how policies are implemented. Mm-hmm. And this class is their chance to play around with how to implement policy at a very large kind of federal government level.
That sounds stressful. Okay, so, and are they sort of put in a role as if they're, I don't know, junior policy advisors, or how does it work on the day? Yeah,
so the class is structured with providing the knowledge they need in real time, and then taking them to the point where they're going to make some policy decisions. So I kick this class off, and I can't give you all the details because there is the potential some of my students may listen to this.
Oh, right.
But it starts off with an activity where the students learn a little bit about resources, and we work around the tragedy of the commons. So the idea that things that are held in common are potentially going to be depleted. So the common example is cod fisheries, right? So nobody owns the cod fisheries, so we go out and we overfish them because there's no kind of incentive to make sure that they're managed. So we start off with a tragedy of the commons exercise, and the students inevitably, and it does involve fish, and they inevitably overfish, and they're left worse off than they would be if they found a way to cooperate, but the game's structured such that cooperation is unlikely.
I see. So right off from the get-go, you're not just telling them about the tragedy of the commons, you're kind of putting them in this game situation.
Yes.
They don't know, the potential outcomes. They're just fishing in some way.
Well, the reality from the tragedy of the commons is that even if you do know you're in that situation, the individual incentives are to not cooperate. It's only when you start to think collectively that you realize that everyone's better off if we cooperate. So climate change is kind of a really classic example of this, where each individual country's incentive is to release as much CO2 in the atmosphere as possible and turn that into energy and fuel your economy with this, and hope that other people cut their emissions and you come out ahead. But if everybody has that individual incentive, we all come out worse off.
Right.
So we kick off with that game, and then the next thing that we bridge into, and you'll in the lesson I pull in some videos as well. So you'll hear Greta Thunberg speak, and hear some inspirational pieces, and then the next thing after we finish the game, though, we introduce the Downs issue attention cycle, which is an interesting piece, and this is it comes out of the environmental research, and it's basically this idea that environmental issues go through 5 phases. So the first phase is the pre-problem stage. So people don't really know it's a problem. It's probably causing issues. So acid rain is kind of the classic example. Acid rain was happening for a long time before it got on the public's radar. So then we get this stage 2 is this alarm discovery and enthusiasm to address the issue.
Okay. So
then we enter phase 3, and this is where we start to do some things to address it, but we realize that there's costs associated with this. It's not going to be really easy to address. And this leads to the general decline in public interest. But the key here is that policymakers in that initial phase of discovery, after discovery, if they're putting in effective policies in place, these policies will keep working even after the public has lost interest.
Okay.
So we don't talk about the ozone layer really much anymore. We certainly don't talk about acid rain. And that's because we effectively put policies in place that have continued to work in the background to address CFC emissions in the case of ozone depletion, sulfur emissions in the case of acid rain.
Right.
Climate change is interesting because it hasn't fit this pattern. And one of the fun things I get to do is I had some students over one summer, and we researched public opinion towards climate change. And we see that climate change has actually in Canada gone through two cycles. Okay. So in 2007, 2008, we actually saw in Ontario in particular, we took some pretty big actions to address climate change. So we shut down all of the coal-powered plants in Ontario. Mm-hmm. And this was a time when there was relatively high interest. And we see in Canada then the interest dropped, and it was my students who actually did the research, so this is kind of exciting. I get to share it in my class. The interest drops, and then all of a sudden, the Great Recession sort of receded, and climate change got back on the agenda again. And we see this kind of renewed interest. So we're in this next kind of uptick phase
right now
in this where people are interested in this. And the reason we're in this next phase is because the first time we were interested in this, we didn't take dramatic enough action to actually address climate change.
So we don't have those policies in place working in the background kind of thing like we might for acid rain.
Exactly, okay. Yeah. So that's the next kind of piece of the lesson is we walk through this, and I actually share my students' research, which is published in a journal. I'm a co-author, but the four of them are the leads on that. So then that brings us to the break, and then we play some more videos, talking about what's going on in municipalities. Then we turn our attention to the federal policy. And here I use a great book by Hal Harvey that talks about climate change solutions. And we walk through in a great detail. So this is probably, and I'm not a big lecturer, I'm more of a guide on the side, get my students active. So this is probably one of the longest lectures I do for the whole semester. But the students usually stay fairly engaged because I tell them what we're going to do at the end is an activity where you have to design your own climate change solution. So I walk through and I talk about a lot of different options on how we can address climate change, really stress the idea that putting a price on carbon is a necessary but not sufficient condition to addressing climate change. So realistically, we need either a carbon tax or some sort of cap and trade system or a hybrid in place for us to be able to address climate change, have any chance of dealing with it. But that alone is not enough. And one of the examples that I'll give is if you imagine a renter, there is no incentive for the person renting a house to make investments in their home to improve the energy efficiency. Even if you're paying the heat and hydro bill, the capital improvements you make are such a long payback that you can't be ensured that it's going to make sense for you. From the landlord's perspective, though, if they're not paying the heat and hydro, there's no real incentive for them to make those improvements either.
Right.
You're not going to be able to rent the place for more money, certainly not enough more to recoup kind of any capital investment. So there's lots of situations like this where just putting a price on carbon isn't enough. So it's a necessary condition. We need to do it, but we can't just do that.
That's such an interesting example. That's like it shifted my thinking the way you just
So the students get this kind of background. They get to see all of these different potential solutions, and then we open the. And I've got a 5-hour class. So this is one of the great things about policy. Yeah.
Holy moly.
So I can really have a fun class. So we spend the first usually 2 hours. So we play the game. I give a relatively long lecture, a few tidbits, and then we use a significant portion of the next 3 hours to actually have the students go and they open the energy policy simulator, which is online. It's updated fairly regularly, and they work and they develop their own climate change solution. And there are literally hundreds of options in here for the students to play around with. And I tell them, you've got to develop a climate change solutions that meets our Paris Accord targets. And then if anybody gets early done, then I say, okay, now let's carry this out. And there's some much longer term targets that they can hit. So the students really work at it and they come up with policy solutions. One of the inevitable things that they do realize is that the price of carbon has to be much higher than currently is in place, and they start to see all of these other pieces. So then we close, and the students we have a discussion about this, and the students write a little reflective paper, not a long one, just kind of a one-pager, and they reflect on what was your climate change solution, what did it look like, and then the follow-up is this politically feasible? And that's where we run into, and this lesson can be a little bit depressing because the reality is in our current political climate, the types of solutions that are going to be needed over the next 20 to 30 years are not politically feasible at all.
Because the general population couldn't stomach them?
We can get into some discussion in class, and we do a little bit about, why is the case? And some of it is the reality that the fossil fuel industry has been lobbying for over 40 years now to make these politically unpalatable. And there is, to a certain degree, a lack of realization amongst the public of how severe a circumstance we are in and how costly climate change actually is going to be. The reality is that if we had started making changes 20 years ago, it would have been expensive, more expensive than doing nothing like we did. Yeah. But compared to the types of costs that we're facing right now, it would be dramatically cheaper. And, think of things like the increase in hurricanes, the increase in forest fires. These are things that have dramatic, massive costs for us as a society. The political challenge is these are costs that are to a certain degree going to be borne today because we haven't done anything, but the bigger costs are coming. They're coming down the road. And if we don't make the right investments now, we can't push those off. So it's certainly a big challenge, and it's one that I like doing in this class because I've got young people in my classroom, and hopefully I'm giving some of them the tools that when they go and work in government, that they're going to be able to have some influence and put us in the right direction for our future generations.
Yeah, I mean, hearing about this lesson, to me, it's a lesson, obviously, but it also seems like a journey and an emotional one at that too, right? Because starting with this game where they're probably the affective domain is coming into play, right? If they're like, oh, wait, I did just overfish and these are the reasons why. And I know better cognitively maybe, but and then, that excitement with coming up with the solution and working together and maybe coming up with the perfect one on paper.
Yes. But
then I love that wrap up, that must be very effective in the classroom. But why don't we push this forward tomorrow then if it's, and.
So I'll give away my takeaway. I still won't give away how the game is exactly played. But one of the big takeaways from the game is that the students, each of their individual teams, they would have come out much farther ahead. And it pointed out very clearly at the end of this game if they just cooperate with one another. But because we don't as humans, and the game is structured in a way that cooperation would be a perfectly acceptable option, but the students don't realize that, and a lot of it actually goes back to our earlier conversations as we've got this idea that the social responsibility of business is to make money. So that's really ingrained deep within our societal expectations. And this game that is easily won by cooperating, the students see it as a very individual activity in their groups, and they don't go to the cooperation step that would be a really natural one if you sit down and say, okay, the goal of this is to maximize my resources for my village and have the most fish over the long term. And if you start to think of a game like that, you think, okay, well, the best way to do that is to talk to people in the other villages and make sure that we all work together. Right. But as soon as you think of, I want to get the most fish.
I might be hungry 3 weeks from now, so better.
You go and you overfish, and then the end result is we're worse off. And that's, when we think about climate change, if we had 40 years ago started talking about, how can we responsibly as a collective world manage our oil resources, we would have been much better off today. But even now, right, where the reality is that we will be better off by cooperating. We're not in a place where that can happen. Some of the new reading that I've done, it talks about sort of the political implications of what sort of a future that we might look like. And I'm probably going to bring this in the next time I teach the class. And the reality of this is that there are some implications where we end up with a world that addresses climate change, but addresses it in a very authoritarian way. And there's some flip options where we become much more cooperative and address it in a more of a democratic way. I think ultimately, maybe I'm a little overly optimistic, I think ultimately we will address climate change, but I think how we address it is still very much open to which sort of world that we gravitate towards in future in addressing this. Are we going to see a few governments get together and put some very top-down, heavy-handed policies, or are we going to see democracy kind of work and people start to buy into the idea that we need to make some changes, and then we can collectively decide what changes are the best for us as a society in Canada, but also as a global community.
It's so fascinating to me because when we started this conversation, you were sharing more about your research, and I said, is it, do you teach on these themes? And you said, well, not directly, but I'm seeing now how, your work with cooperatives and other things really infuses lessons, right? And,
yes.
And then also leads to much bigger philosophical questions like, sure, I am optimistic like you, and I believe a lot in cooperation. But there's the other side of the coin, right? Like the Hobbesians who think, no, our state of nature is brutal and competitive.
Yeah.
And do you ever encounter that in the classroom? Do students say that kind of distrust in the compassion of others or in the belief in cooperation in general?
So I've got some drop-ins in my lecture that I've designed. And these are pieces that if I have somebody who really, denies climate change exists at kind of a basic level, I've got some drop-ins that I can do. I've even got one that talks about why somebody who buys into climate change as a hoax will also buy into other conspiracy theories. So I can bring that in. I've never actually had to do it yet, though. And I have had some students who came into the class being very skeptical about climate change. And by the end of the class, they were buying into this idea that, we need to do something about it. So they didn't come in as, it's a big conspiracy theory. So like those people are hard to move, but they were just like, maybe it's overblown sort of attitude I had from some students. And then we kind of really walk through. And once they do the simulator and say, okay, the thinking is like, this will be easy. We'll just address it like we've addressed other problems. The reality is this isn't ozone depletion. This isn't acid rain. This is now at a point much later where we need to take more dramatic actions because we didn't act soon enough when we first learned that this was a problem, which was probably in the 70s and 80s.
And have you seen, similar to those who might, be a little resistant to believing in everything they hear about climate change, have you had those who resist maybe this tendency to cooperate, that feel like, oh no, your responsibility is to stakeholders and shorter term and that kind of thing? Do you ever receive that sort of pushback from students?
Not so much, but I teach in public service programs, so I've got an opt-in bias here where students are wanting to work in government in the nonprofit sector, so they tend to already buy into that. I imagine if I taught this as part of an undergraduate class where I've got maybe more of a mixed social sciences background, I would probably get a little more of that.
And I like you use that term drop-ins. You have some drop-ins. Do you mean by that like a little lesson you could insert in the middle of another lesson if there was a dissenting voice? Yeah,
so I have hidden slides on my deck. So I'm ready if I and I don't normally do that, but for this one I said, okay, this is potentially a controversial topic. I want to be prepared for this possibility that somebody's going to reject the central thesis of the entire lesson. Oftentimes, I'm more of a guide on the side. If there's something controversial in the classroom, I usually let the other students just kind of take care of it because I find I've got a graduate level class. Student dialogue will usually bring people in. But for this one, I wanted to be prepped just in case I get some significant pushback. And that being said, I haven't had it. So maybe I've been overly cautious on this.
But a neat tactic, right? Well, and I think it is an emotional issue too, right? And we know, what is it, Gen Z now? Research shows that they're troubled by this, right? And they're growing up in a world where they don't know what the environment is going to look like for their children. And so I think, probably wise, even if you usually take a guide on the side stance to just be prepared for the emotionality of this kind of discussion too.
I am also careful to acknowledge that this isn't, it's often framed as a left-right issue, and we've done that. But the reality is acid rain was led by Brian Mulroney. So we had a conservative prime minister that played an instrumental role in addressing environmental problems. A good environment is good for business at the end of the day. So I am able to draw on that, and I usually do kind of include that subtly in the lesson. So even if I have students that may come into the class being a little more right-leaning and thinking like, no, this is a kind of a, and those are the students that came in with a little skepticism. That tends to get them to buy in and say, okay, you know what, even though some political parties are being skeptical of this right now, the reality is it's not really a left-right issue, and there are right-wing solutions. The price on climate is one that is often advocated by right-leaning parties that haven't become too skeptical of climate change.
Wow, well, we have just a limited time left together today, Anthony. You had mentioned to me at the start, you had a second lesson that you were considering sharing too. Would you like to say a little bit? It's a new lesson, if I understand correctly.
Yes. So this is my favorite lesson that I teach regularly. The favorite lesson that I taught is one that I taught on March 13th, 2020.
Okay. Oh, my.
And it's a lesson that I designed in under 6 hours. So I taught, so March 13th, 2020 is the last day that we had on-person classes at Conestoga College before we closed for the pandemic.
So you taught this one in class on that day?
Afternoon,
Oh, my. Oh, wow.
So in the weeks leading up to that, I was chatting with my students saying, okay, it's very likely that campus is going to be closed. And we were talking about, we had some in-person presentations, changing kind of the timeline on those, and it happened even faster than sort of predicted. So this was on the radar of the class, and I taught at that point, it was a leadership class, but these were public service students, so they were interested in public admin. So going into that March 12th, I hear the Rudy Gobert news that he's tested positive, the basketball player with COVID.
Yeah.
It became really apparent that things were going to happen very quickly at this point. We're leading into March break for students in Ontario. As soon as the Rudy Gobert news came out, it was obvious to those that were following that students were not coming back at the end of March break. So with that, I reached out to my chair and said, I want to do something different with this class. Is that okay? And he was very supportive, said, great idea. So I spent the morning, and he actually gave me some input. We had a meeting that morning, redesigning my lecture and doing one that was specific to where we are in the pandemic right now. And then I dropped in a bunch of decision points for my students. I said, there was a conference that I had for my credit union that I was planning to attend. So I talked about that conference. I talked about what do you do if you're a professional sports league.
Oh, wow.
I talked about what do you do if you're John Tibbetts in this situation. Dr. Tibbetts had the day before basically released a stay tuned message. We're making decisions today. During my class, the announcement actually came out that the college would be closing. But the students had realized that probably about 20 minutes earlier in the class, because that was one of their decision points. We made a decision point at the province level. So this was a really interesting one. So I pulled in information from the 1919 Spanish flu pandemic. Talked about what happened with that pandemic. I pulled in some comparison between different cities that locked down, that didn't lock down. Pulled in information about what happened in China. Pulled in information about Italy. I brought in some of my board governance pieces and talked about, what should an individual board of directors be doing, thinking, nonprofits as well in this circumstance. What sort of conversations should they be having in a crisis? And what was really interesting is that every one of the decisions that my students made were the exact same decisions that people in public office were making at the same time.
Oh, wow. Well, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in that moment with I remember that day. I remember everybody's pulse was racing, right? And just what are we going to do? What should we do? So to have them sort of be, almost in the hot seat while they're living it. What a neat thing to experience.
And it's interesting too now, because as I'm prepping for this, I just looked over my lesson notes, and it was interesting to look back in time at the knowledge that we knew at that point, and some of the things that we were talking about in class. So my students talked about how we really need to put resources into getting a vaccine in place, because that's they realized that was the key to us moving forward. Project Warp Speed in the United States really did that, and we see that a lot of the they made the individual decisions. It was a lot of stay open, close. What do you do? But then some of the macro level conversations, they were kind of right in line with where we needed to go as a society at that time as well.
Wow. And what do you think it is about either your teaching style or your experience that gave you the confidence to sort of pivot and change up that lesson from what it was maybe going to be on that particular day to say, well, this is going on in the world. Students probably want a space to talk about it.
So for me, I like to have fun in the classroom. And I like to make sure that the classroom is engaged. And I thought about the night before, I said, if I go and just teach the normal leadership lesson, is anyone going to be listening to my lecture?
Right.
I said, and for me, am I going to be thinking about my lecture? Not at all, right? I'm going to be thinking about this. So I said, well, why don't we talk about what everybody's going to want to talk about on Friday? Think back, this is March 2020. We wanted to talk about it. This is not,
no.
6 months later, we don't want to think about it at all.
Yeah, it's so true, huh? I was reading about recently how it's just fascinating how there's very few, TV shows or movies that are about the pandemic, and it's really because nobody wants to go back there. It's a little too close. Well, thank you, Anthony. Just in closing, I'm wondering, sometimes I like to ask guests if they have something about them that their students and colleagues might not know, that's maybe a little quirky or surprising.
So you prepped me with this question, and I thought about something that my kids really like about me and are excited about it. When I was in high school, I am, amongst my friends from Niagara Falls, the Taco Bell taco eating champion.
Oh, my.
So I won by eating 16 tacos.
Ooh.
Didn't feel great after.
I feel a little nauseous just hearing that story.
And it was down to me and my one friend, Adam, and he had the 15th taco in front of him to tie me. And he said, if I eat that taco, you're just going to eat another one, aren't you? I said, if you don't want to finish it, I'll finish it for you. So I won 16-14.
Wow. And what a way to win.
Yeah. Okay. And you're the reigning champion.
We decided never to do said contest again.
Did you suffer the next day?
Learning a valuable lesson.
The hour after?
Yeah.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Reigning taco eating champion here within our walls at Conestoga. Well, thank you, Anthony. Thank you so much for being here. I feel like I could continue this conversation for days, so I hope we have another opportunity to speak soon. But thanks for sharing what you did today.
Thanks for having me, Lauren. I had a lot of fun.
Well, we have come to the end of another episode of My Favorite Lesson, a podcast hosted by Teaching and Learning at Conestoga College. You can find all episodes in this series and more by following Teaching and Learning at Conestoga on YouTube. You can also find this podcast on Spotify and other places you get your podcasts. If you subscribe, you'll be notified each time a new episode becomes available. For 24/7 support for all things teaching and learning related, please check out our Faculty Learning Hub at tlconestoga.ca. I'm Dr. Lauren Spring, reminding you, as the great bell hooks once said, that the classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. Until next time.